Mark, what are the keys to conducting an effective listing presentation?
Well, an effective listing presentation is one where you come away with the signature.
Of course, that's right.
Now, the key components, I think, and I think this has changed dramatically inside of the real estate transaction over the last 10 years really, is that you've got to have 100% product knowledge. But the weird phenomena these days is that you really only are likely to use about 10% of everything that you have on board.
Why is that?
Well, I'm finding that people are time poor these days and they're expectant of instant competency. Now, so you need to be able to demonstrate or at least have the aura of being thoroughly competent and then be able to decipher with your initial exchange with that potential prospect as to which 10% you put in front of them, because you get it wrong, you miss the listing.
So how do you know? How do you know what to put in front of them?
Well, you know, there are some fairly obvious variables. They, of course, are price advice and comparative price versus market value. The second one might be fees and charges and what the investment needs to be around marketing. They're the more obvious ones. But I prefer, if you like, to set up a premise by which they're choosing me based upon my ability around marketing, negotiation, and of course communication. I mean, most estate agents, they know that they need to have marketing investment, but they can't really explain to you
why.
Well, in the first instance, precisely what marketing is.
Oh, okay.
Now, marketing's about creating perceptions, and those perceptions, of course, become a reality to the recipient. The second thing is, as it relates to marketing, how it is that marketing actually leverages value beyond comparison, beyond compare. Now, I hear a lot of salespeople say that a property's worth what a buyer or the market's prepared to bear. I think that's nonsense. I think a good salesperson says a property's worth what I can make it worth. So if I can create a perception so that that property looks at the very least its best, but in some ways better than it actually is, then I stand a very good chance of leveraging that value beyond comparison into an area that I call market value.
Okay, give me an example of how you could do that.
Well, it's very simple. It might be video marketing, it might be the angulation of the photographs, it might be the way in which you arrange the furniture. All of these things these days are available to us. You know, even this might sound like a very simple one, but I was in Brisbane the other day and we listed a property, and we basically gave the house a name. Now, the owners looked at me and thought that was a bit far-fetched to start with, but as soon as we did, all of the prospects that were coming through, this was an acreage property, started to refer to it by name, and it gave it the right, I guess, aura.
Mark, let's talk about price, the big stumbling block for a lot of agents in the presentation.
Well, the first thing you've got to do is create some clarification. There's a vast chasm between price and value. My favourite response in a listing presentation when a seller says to me, "What's my property worth?" is I basically say to them, "I don't know." Because if we're to be honest, if we're to talk about market value, we can't be certain as to where that sits without actually taking it to market. Now, there's a load of things that you bring to the property in promotion, marketing, the negotiation, setting the right parameters with buyers, and then of course the communication that you might have that can leverage that value. And then of course, if two people like the same property, then the scarcity principle comes into play. So, you know, a lot of agents, I should say, don't fully understand the difference between the two. There's a fabulous book out there, and it's called Priceless by a guy called William Poundstone. And it talks about how buyers anchor or get their reference point for value in a real estate transaction. I think it's a weird phenomena that, you know, buyers, if they chose to, could readily source information on comparative value of properties prior to actually going ahead with the purchase, but they rarely do. So this tells us that it is still an emotional transaction. It tells us that if we as salespeople understand all of the principles that underpin pricing and value, then we can manipulate this to the advantage of our clients.
So Mark, you're saying there's a difference between comparative value and market value?
Most definitely. You know, comparative value is the realistic assessment, and as I say, it's the fodder by which valuers base their realistic appraisal of value. So what I say is valuers calculate value. Now, in contrast, we should be, as real estate salespeople, focused on market value. Now, market value is not based upon reality, it's based upon possibility. So as I say, valuers calculate worth, whereas marketers create value.
Hello and welcome to Auction Update. Kevin Brogan from CoreLogic in just a moment will tell us that auction numbers have doubled in Melbourne for this weekend, but last weekend Sydney faltered just a little bit. Back in a moment.
Did you know you can save up to 70% on your staff costs by outsourcing the low-value, repeatable tasks so your team can focus on growing your business? Beepo is an outsourcing provider focused on the real estate industry. With an English-speaking, tertiary qualified and fully trained team in the Philippines, Beepo will give your business the boost it needs to start growing and returning value to you. For more information, visit beepo.com.au.
And welcome to the show once again, Kevin Brogan from CoreLogic. G'day, Kevin. How you doing?
Very good, thanks, Kevin. And you?
Mate, I'm fantastic, thank you. A little bit chilly, but you expect that around this time of year, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. And it definitely has an impact on auction activity on a seasonal basis.
Yeah, it does. Although auction numbers this weekend have doubled, but that's on the back of a slow weekend, long weekend last weekend, Kevin.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the Queen's birthday weekend was celebrated in most Australian states and territories, not in Queensland. But it did obviously have a very significant impact, more so in Melbourne than Sydney, but nonetheless across the nation.
Yeah, I think the Queen's pretty lucky. You know, I wouldn't mind having 2 birthdays a year.
No, that's right. And the irony here is we celebrated her birthday actually on Prince Philip's 98th birthday, which was on the 10th of June.
Yeah, there you go. Bit of interesting information for you. Okay, well, let's pull up the capital city stats, the final stats. And as we sort of predicted on Monday, we did actually fall below 50% in the weighted average.
Yeah, look, that's right. I mean, we by the time we get to Thursday, we've got just over 80% of, I think it's 83% of results. By the time we get those in, we've got all of those results, which may have been, under negotiation after having passed in. But, there's probably a slightly higher proportion of sales that are unsuccessful reported in the latter part of the week. So it's actually 10% down almost on last week's weighted average. I think I said at the top there that Sydney faltered just a little bit. It's still at 56%. And we say still. Yes.
Is that surprising to you, Kevin?
Look, I think when we have reduced activity, we do get an increased volatility in the data. So, I wouldn't read too much into it just on the basis of a single weekend, particularly a holiday weekend. But obviously, it is, as you say, a slight faltering in the market. But, we need to interpret it in the context of the trend. And overall, we have seen a trend of increased confidence since the election.
I've got to say, I'm a little bit disappointed with the Brisbane number at 22.5%. Off a good number of auctions, 161. We're seeing that number drop. We'll bring it up in a moment. But that is somewhat of a disappointing result, I think.
Oh, look, I think that is very much at the lower range. I think that's the lowest final clearance that we've had this year. I mean, all through the first quarter of 2019, we saw Brisbane between the high 20s. I think it crept up into the 40% range on one occasion. So this is actually really quite low. But the biggest weekend in Brisbane this year.
Okay, well, let's have a look at the Sydney sub-regions. That might tell us a little bit of a story about what happened there. Some not reporting at all, Kevin?
No, look, I think you're right. I mentioned the volatility in data. When we get fewer than 10 results, we don't publish a clearance rate because it's just too volatile. And the number of sub-regions that have not applicable returns shows you how few results there actually were, or how few auction sales were actually attempted over the holiday weekend.
Yeah, we can see those low numbers there on the right-hand side. What about, City and Inner South at 76%? That's probably the leader.
Absolutely. The city and inner south obviously had a reasonable amount of activity. I mean, you can see it's well down on where it was the previous week and well down on where it'll be this coming week. But nonetheless, with 48 results collected, we're fairly confident in the almost 77% clearance rate, which is a really good outcome for that area.
Okay, we'll bring up the Melbourne sub-regions now. Yeah, some pretty good results there. I think one in the 80s, one in the 70s.
Absolutely. No, we've mentioned before how Melbourne sub-regions typically are much more uniform than the Sydney in terms of their results. The volatility component does creep in with such lower auction activity, but nonetheless, I mean, if you look at the inner east, I mean, sort of almost 85% clearance rate, albeit off low volumes, is still quite an impressive result. The volatility, as I mentioned, Mornington Peninsula at 45.5%. We've actually seen that above 80. Then I think last week it went down to below 30, and now it's back up to 45.
Okay, well, this weekend CoreLogic are tracking almost 1,500 auctions in total. Sydney up a little bit, up to 505 from last weekend's 313, Kevin.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, it is a modest increase. I think this is the seasonal component we're seeing, factoring into the equation, because this typically isn't the time of year that we see high auction volumes. The increase in Melbourne is very much higher. And for whatever reason, public holidays are taken that much more seriously in Victoria and Melbourne, and they really do show a significant drop-off in activity on long weekends.
Yeah, well, of course, Melbourne, still the preferred method of sale is auction in Melbourne. It is the powerhouse for Australia, really. I mean, Sydney does do big auction numbers, but by comparison, Melbourne seems to be a lot more of a vintage area for auctions, Kevin, and it is something that they take quite seriously in that market.
Oh, look, it definitely is, Kevin. I mean, in markets like Brisbane and Adelaide, for example, where you have far fewer auctions, there's not the general acceptance that any property might go to auction. Agents in those cities really look for properties with a little special something that is going to be tested in open competition in an auction. In Melbourne, as you say, preferred method of sale for many properties. And I think, when market conditions softened, like they did at the end of last year, you see the auction clearance rate hit fairly hard, because the properties being auctioned are properties of which there's a plentiful supply. So that is reflected in these results.
So what's your tip for the, what do you think we'll be talking about on Monday? Do you see that the clearance rate might jump a little bit?
Look, I think there is clearly more confidence in the marketplace after the election. I think that the things that do mitigate against that is as yet there are people who may be looking to enter the market who are still facing the APRA serviceability buffer at 7.25%. That means that the cut in interest rates may not be available to them until they can actually pass that serviceability hurdle. So I think some of the demand in the market is probably just going to bide its time. But I do expect that we'll see sort of continued stronger results than pre-election.
Well, we'll certainly know on Monday when Kevin Brogan comes back, and of course CoreLogic provide us with all the data and track this for us. They work heavily over the weekend to bring us all this information. Kevin Brogan will be back with me again on Monday. Watch out for that. We'll give you a full wrap on the weekend's results, and we'll take you into the top sales in the 6 areas that we cover around Australia. Kevin Brogan from CoreLogic, thanks for your time, mate, and your wonderful insight, and look forward to talking to you on Monday.
Thanks very much. Looking forward to it.